everyone. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the NL seminar. We're very excited to have Jaspreet Ranjit from USC here, presenting her work titled Oath Frames, Characterizing Online Attitudes Towards Homelessness with LLM Assistance. Jaspreet is a third-year PhD student in computer science at the University of Southern California, advised by Professor Swabha Swayamdipta in the DILL Lab, and also a student leader in the Center for AI and Society. Her research interests lie in investigating to what extent language models can help us understand sensitive societal issues, for example, homelessness and suicide interventions, by exploring collaborative settings between social science experts and generative models. Previously, she earned her MS and BS degree from the University of Virginia in computer science as a Rodman Scholar. And so we're very excited to welcome Jaspreet for her talk.
Thank you, Katie, and I am extremely excited to be talking about my work, Oath Frames, Characterizing Online Attitudes Towards Homelessness with LLM Assistance. This work was jointly done between the School of Engineering and the School of Social Work, and an acronym that I will be repeatedly using is PEH, which stands for People Experiencing Homelessness. Brief content warning, some of the material that we'll be talking about might be offensive or upsetting. So as we all are probably already aware living in Los Angeles, discourse on homelessness elicits a very diverse and nuanced spectrum of attitudes. And at its worst, this kind of discourse can express very harmful rhetoric against compromised populations like PEH. And almost every day, there's these countless number of news headlines that are discussing this issue, often in the context of the government, their policies, reform measures that they might be developing. And this results in often reactive and inflammatory comments on social media in reaction to this issue. So you might be asking yourself, why is it important for us to study these kinds of public perceptions and attitudes towards homelessness? We're going to talk a little bit about the policy formulation ecosystem, what goes into formulating a policy. There have been some past studies that have identified factors that can serve as essentially, intermediary actors use these kinds of factors or engage in lobbying, public opinion, they may engage in protests, or they may characterize the economic development of their locality, all in an effort to influence the formulation of a policy. And these intermediary actors can be advocacy organizations or political constituents, and they use these factors to push forward their own reform and relief efforts. As an example, we talked with the Homelessness Policy Research Institute at USC, and they emphasized the importance for advocacy organizations to leverage public interest as a way to time when to push forward their reform and relief efforts. As an example, if there is an overtly positive sentiment in the media towards a particular reform measure, it would be advantageous for that organization to push forward their reform effort at that time so they can garner more public support. And that's exactly what I want to study in this project, which is, given the diversity in public opinion on social media, how can we characterize attitudes towards homelessness in online discourse? And particularly, how can we help advocacy organizations do this task? And a spoiler alert, this is extremely challenging to do for a variety of reasons. Not only is it time-taking to manually surf through this kind of data, but the data can contain explicit content. It can be mentally challenging to process at a large scale. Additionally, attitudes are subjective and interpretive. So my prior experiences or my exposure to homelessness, my familiarity with the topic, engagement with the community, etc., can all contribute to differing interpretations of attitudes, which makes this task a lot more subjective and nuanced. And I think it's pretty obvious that it's important to contextualize our work in different social and political factors as those have an effect on public perceptions and attitudes. And for all these reasons, it's incredibly important for us to have domain experts in the loop, contributing and providing guidance in every step of the project. So given all of those challenges, naturally we ask ourselves, can large language models help us assist social work experts in scaling up the characterization of attitudes towards homelessness? And another spoiler alert, we're going to be talking about in this project how we use how we use large language models as assistants to annotate more than 2 million posts on Twitter characterizing attitudes towards homelessness. So let's get into this first question here. How do we, quote unquote, frame this post? So framing theory comes from social science and has been used in the past to identify aspects in an issue's portrayal that are more or less emphasized to influence broader public opinion. And the theory suggests that how something is presented to an audience can influence how people choose to process that information. As an example of what that looks like, this tweet reads, at mention, how about do something for all the homeless veterans and Americans on the streets? You'll give millions to the immigrants crossing our so-called secure border, but our homeless Americans get nothing. You are merely trying to buy votes. So right off the bat, we see that this post is directed towards the government. They're talking about some politician critiquing some politician for how they're allocating money, aid, and resources amongst veterans experiencing homelessness and immigrants. And we also see these attitudes of who is more or less deserving of money, aid, or resources, where often compromised populations, unfortunately, are put in competition against each other for who should get the resources first. And a quick note, I know I highlighted some parts of the tweet here, but we're not necessarily doing span level annotations. This is simply for illustration purposes. So prior work has looked at this task before, what are attitudes and perceptions towards homelessness, but it's primarily been done through surveys and ethnographic studies, which, although are extremely valuable, they're also very expensive to conduct and can only be done at a much smaller scale. There is some work here from Jack Tsai's group that looked at how your own public exposure to homelessness can influence your attitudes towards the issue. From the same group, they also looked at changing public attitudes between 1990 and 2016, again, via a survey of around 500 US adults. And in the 1990s, there was the Attitudes Towards Homelessness Inventory, which categorized attitudes into subscales around personal characteristics, societal causes, affiliations, essentially your compassion, and empathy towards PEH. And more recently, there was some work titled Street Talk. So they identified 3 broad narratives that emerge in homelessness discourse, namely sin talk, sick talk, and system talk. And probably most related to our work, there was some research from Berkeley where they manually annotated 6,000 tweets for stigma against PEH. They were framing stigma against people experiencing homelessness on Twitter. So let's get into how we went about data collection and frame discovery. We first collected 3.1 million posts from Twitter using a keyword search back when the Twitter API was publicly available. And we took a subset of these posts and we applied a qualitative iterative process called grounded theory. And we worked in collaboration with some folks from the School of Social Work to surface our 9 finer grained frames that describe attitudes towards homelessness. And to step back a bit, grounded theory is essentially a process where in our initial subset of posts, we extracted as many frames as we could. And then we iteratively labeled more subsets of posts to identify the most relevant frames. We grouped them together until we reached thematic saturation. So by this time when we were labeling our final subset of posts, we weren't coming up with any new attitudes. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask what you mean by a frame in this context?
Yeah, sure. So I like to draw the distinction between agenda setting theory and framing theory. So agenda setting theory might identify what you're talking about, whereas a framing theory identifies how you're talking about it. So if we want to take, for example, the difference between semantic frames and pragmatic frames, government critique might have the same semantics in the context of immigration and homelessness, but it has very different pragmatics when you consider that frame in different contexts. So in homelessness, it might be critique towards housing reform policies, whereas in the domain of immigration, it might mean critique towards border control policies.
Okay, I feel like your answer is a little bit too for I'm curious that I actually understood what you mean just by the beginning.
Sure, yeah.
Can we get you some of your answer a little bit more? I guess.
Yeah, sure. So, how we're talking about the issue of government critique in the context of homelessness. So, if we take one of our frames as an example, say the frame of government critique, how is government critique being talked about in the context of homelessness as opposed to a different context? Yeah.
So the ontology of and is are you using like overlapping labels? Like says one tweet have more than one, or you assign 1 to 1?
Yeah. So it's a 9-way multi-label classification test. So one tweet can have more than one frame as a label. Yeah, and as an example here, here's some examples of what our frame definitions look like, which I'll get into to give you more context for exactly what a frame is in our study. But in addition to developing our topology itself, one of our main contributions was developing an extensive codebook that provided precise definitions of what each of the frames were, along with guidelines that provided instructions on how to do our annotation task. And these guidelines captured some of the more domain-specific nuances that are particular to our task. And we're going to go into some examples later on. And yeah, here's a snapshot of what our frame definitions look like, an abridged version of the definition, that is. So for the government critique example, this reads criticism about government body, policies, and laws, including discussion of homelessness through the lens of political parties and values. NIMBY, not in my backyard, comes up pretty often in homelessness discourse. It talks about opposition by residents to proposed developments in their local area. And then the deserving, undeserving attitude, which we saw earlier on, describes perpetuating a hierarchy of PEH with other marginalized communities. And in this way, for all 9 of our frames, we developed these definitions in collaboration with our collaborators from the School of Social Work.
You mentioned something about choosing the number of frames based on like saturation, or could you just go more into detail about how you knew you had enough frames to continue?
Yeah, sure. So this concept of grounded theory was inspired by prior work on this work from Berkeley, where they were manually coding 6,000 tweets for stigma against PEH. So very similar process. We first started with a random sample of posts, and we, in a team of 6 domain experts and trained experts, came up with as many frames that categorize attitudes. And I think initially we started with around 50 frames. And the iterative process of grounded theory involved us grouping similar frames together. So essentially, you can consider oath frames kind of like a hierarchy. Hypothetically, there are subframes under each of these broader frames. And the way that we decided when we reached thematic saturation was we iteratively annotated smaller subsets of posts. And once we were not generating any new attitudes, or any new attitudes weren't being surfaced, and we were able to label with our current set of 9 frames, that's when we kind of stopped. And there's also this trade-off between what we can get a language model to do effectively versus what we as human annotators have time to annotate for. 9-way multi-label classification task for this kind of subjective task is already very difficult, as we're going to see.
So how does this differ from, you said the Street Talk had an ontology that presumably the Berkeley paper also did? I'm wondering, what governed your decision to say not to be used categories there, and also how they fit in, especially thinking about the future work we might want to use both data sets together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can talk about the Berkeley paper first. Berkeley paper was specifically looking at harmful rhetoric or stigma against PEH, and our oath frames topology is a little bit abstracted out of that. We do have a harmful generalization category, which includes a lot of the kinds of stigma that was surfaced in this paper. And we talk about that in our work as well, that that frame, a lot of the inspiration for that frame came from this prior work. And then the syntaxic talk system talk framework, again, one of the limitations that they cited in their own work was that it was very coarse-grained. And our whole idea with the oath frames topology was to see how much finer grained can we get, what kinds of insights are advocacy organizations expecting to get from this analysis in a way that's going to help them inform their own reform and policy efforts. So our first stab at annotating our data was in a team of experts and trained experts. So in a team of 6 annotators, we were able to annotate 4.1K posts. And as expected, this took a pretty long time. We were averaging to around 3 minutes per post. And our inter-annotator agreement, we used Coesis Kappa, was around 0.47, which is considered moderate agreement given that this was a 9-way multi-label classification task.
Complete agreement you need, or just like a binary decision or category?
Yeah, binary decision category. Yeah. So yeah, naturally we ask ourselves, can we make this more efficient? What are ways in which we can scale this up or use LLMs as assistants to social workers in doing this particular task? And prior work has actually championed the use of LLMs as annotation assistants in domains of social science. There was some work that from Brigham University that showed that GPT-3 was matching the performance of human annotators in areas of political science. There was also some prior work that provided guidance on how to evaluate your large language model when coding or when annotating in these kinds of sensitive domain settings. And then there was also recent work that particularly provided instructions on how to incorporate your codebook in the LLM prompt to ensure, or to the best of your ability, ensure that your model is following the instructions in your codebook. But I want to point out that all of this prior work has evaluated on relatively simpler and less subjective tasks than ours. For example, the first paper was evaluating on a 3-way multi-class classification setting. And although it might be fine to use, I don't know, actually, although it might be okay to use an LLM on its own in these kinds of more simpler settings, we wanted to take inspiration from these prior approaches, but also see how well a language model would perform on our more subjective and nuanced tasks and what that setting might look like. So our second stab at annotating our data was a experts plus LLM collaborative setting. And using the setting, we were able to annotate an additional 4.1K posts. And before we get into the method or how we went about doing that, we were able to achieve a 6.5 time average speed up in how quickly we were able to annotate our posts using this collaborative setting. So it did result in some gains in efficiency.
Without loss of kappa.
Yes. And our experts plus LLM collaborative setting consisted of two main parts, which we're going to be talking about. So our prompt structure consisted of our task definition, which was our 9-way multi-label classification task. It had our definitions, so these were coming straight from the codebook. It also had instructions on the format in which to return the frames, along with an instruction to provide a chain of thought reasoning for why it was selecting that particular frame. And one observation that we had when looking at the chain of thought explanations was that it actually provides some signal as to how the model was interpreting our definition. As a reminder, our guidelines provided some of these edge cases in our annotation scheme that weren't necessarily captured by our definitions alone. So our prompt editing process on a high level, and we'll get into this here, on a high level, involved domain experts iteratively adding in parts of our annotation guidelines back into the prompt to capture some of the edge cases and domain-specific nuances that were particular to our task. In this case scenario, the example tweet calls something set to homeless edition because it's not working properly. And in this particular domain, homelessness is sometimes used as a derogatory term to describe something that's dysfunctional or of low quality. And that's an example of a nuance that was captured in our guidelines, but not necessarily in our definition. And when we were testing GPT-4 on trying to capture these kinds of nuances, we saw that it wasn't doing a great job. So we added those kinds of guidelines back into the prompt. And we saw that ultimately this resulted in better performance in capturing some of these edge cases where homelessness is being used as a metaphor or a simile and things like that.
Is that the entire tweet in this case?
I think this is an abridged version. Maybe like the first half of it is cut off, but
I'm wondering whether, I mean, like, it's really kind of inexplicable to me.
Right.
I wonder if there's an image associated with it. I also wonder if it's in some kind of context of a chain. And that, like, motivates my question of, so these are just posts, they're not replies, right?
Yes.
And you generally don't include any kind of context.
Right. Yeah, we don't include image data here. Yeah.
And in your, did you do any annotation?
Sorry?
Did you do any annotation at any point? Oh, a lot. Did you think, and if you did, how frequently do you think, like, oh, I would understand this better if I had some more context, like a chain or an image or anything like that?
Absolutely. I mean, in our pre-processing, we removed tweets that had links or were links on their own, because again, those are difficult to interpret. But it's a good point. Tweets that are much shorter in length are often much more difficult to interpret because they have some associated image and things like that with them. Yeah. And I know we're talking about prompt editing here, but I want to emphasize that we didn't use GPT-4 on its own to do our annotation task for this very reason. It's difficult for us to ensure that GPT is able to capture some of these very domain-specific references and nuances, no matter how much prompt editing that we do. And to give you another example of what GPT was struggling with, when the target group was not explicitly mentioned in the tweet, we saw that GPT was not able to appropriately capture what the frames were associated with that tweet. So this one reads, at mention, it appears the problem in El Paso with illegal aliens were solved overnight, so that you could have a photo op without anyone seeing hundreds of homeless illegals on the streets. And here they're discussing a displacement sweep, which is often followed by a photo op by a politician. And although government critique is not explicitly mentioned, politicians often enact these displacement sweeps to do these photo ops. And for a domain expert, it's kind of easy to glean that information from this tweet, whereas GPT-4 was kind of confusing. Is this directed at the government? Is this directed at the society? And this is a good example of how it wasn't able to resolve these domain-specific references, and it would often predict both of these frames for this particular tweet. And that's exactly why we do expert validation of our GPT-generated annotations. So this is the same tweet that we saw earlier on. And GPT-4, we first got GPT-4 to predict the frames for this tweet. And one observation that we made is that GPT-4 was generating a lot of false positives. So the precision was low, the recall was high. And that's exactly why we chose to have experts go in post hoc and kick out false positive labels. In this case scenario, experts decided that societal critique didn't belong.
What is my best critique according to your?
Yeah, essentially critiquing general society for how they're treating PEH. An example would be that we all are not doing enough for PEH. That's a simple example. Yeah. And we found that this kind of post hoc validation, where experts were simply validating the post, kicking out frames that didn't belong, resulted in a 6.5 time average speed up per post.
Did you do any double annotation where you compare the expert only versus expert so?
Double only, like comparing.
What happens if just experts annotate versus if experts with the LLM annotate the same tweet?
Yeah, so if you're asking about like the comparison between the annotation performance, the agreement.
Yeah.
So so we had a set of multiply annotated posts for experts only, and then we had a set of multiply annotated posts for experts plus LLM. So you're asking how we agreed on those two subsets.
Well, actually, what I'm asking is whether it's the use of an automated process as a pre-process, has at least roots to like the early 90s. The tree bank was annotated in that way,
right?
And there's definitely always bias towards not changing anything,
right?
So I'm wondering if you saw that and to what degree you saw that the cases of the human annotated ones versus having a different profile that don't agree with the original LLM. And then also how similar the expert annotation was to the LLM annotation.
That's a good question, yeah, and like probably a great baseline to run to understand what are the differences in those two kinds of annotation procedures. I think here we were as a baseline, like if humans are not biased by the priors that the LLM already has or that they're being shown.
you're claiming this?
No, I'm asking if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that, well,
Sure.
that's
Yeah, that's true. Right.
almost not debatable, but like,
Right.
the question is what do you believe?
Right.
And what ends up being the consequence of that?
Right.
Do you have the pre-expert adjusted predictions in your data set?
Pre-expert adjusted, like on the same subset that experts LLM or annotated experts only annotations.
Sure.
Yeah.
No. Well, yes, you have that. You have the experts only, then you have experts.
Right.
I'm wondering if you have the LLM.
LLM only. Yes.
So we can go and do that analysis.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, we'll get into that in just like 2 slides. So we can talk about that. Ultimately, we decided to use both our experts and experts LLM annotations to fine tune a classifier, because again, validating every single post is not the ideal case scenario. It's still the case that experts are exposed to every single post. So they may be still exposed to that graphic content. And we recognize that fine-tuning a classifier, it results in silver standard annotation. So it's not necessarily as good as if experts only were annotating. But in this way, we were able to scale up our O-frames annotations to 2.4 million posts.
Sorry, quick question on what the experts do after they get a series of labels from the LLM. Are they just filtering out the false positives, or that's it? Okay.
Yes, exactly. They're only kicking out the false positives.
They're not adding anything in.
Right. Yeah. They're only kicking out the false positives. Yeah, and this was motivated from an observation that we had where the GPT was generating a lot of false positives. So that's what kind of motivated that. If they were adding labels back in, experts might as well do the task on their own from scratch. Yeah. I'm going to skip the slide here. Let's get right into the data annotation performance. Here we're showing the macro and micro F1 scores that are aggregated across all of our frames, across our different annotation strategies. So the main takeaway here, and so this is evaluated on a set of multiply annotated posts, and the standard deviation is calculated using each expert annotator as a reference. And the main takeaway here is that the expert plus GPT-4 and our fine-tuned classifier, namely FLAN-T5 large, are performing pretty well in comparison to the experts. Of course, they're not doing as good as the experts, but we get these benefits in efficiency and scale while not losing too much annotation performance in comparison to the experts. So again, there's this trade-off of how much more efficient can we make this process? How much can we scale this up versus how well we can do on this particular annotation task? And we also have the performance of GPT-4 on its own. It's performing the worst on its own on this particular annotation task. And we're not really using GPT-4 on its own in any capacity in our analysis anyways for this reason.
So get the expert average, say micro average, you're holding one expert out and considering them both standards.
Yeah, leave one out.
And then averaging over all of those.
Right.
And then when you're doing the expert plus GPT-4, using like the consensus of the experts as the gold standard?
We use each expert as a like a reference, and then we compare to, say, expert plus GPT-4.
So you basically do this study 6 times.
Right. And this is to account for the variation that we had amongst ourselves as annotators as well. As an initial result, we found that in our 2.4 million annotated posts, the most salient attitudes were government critique and solutions and interventions. And using our now 2.4 million annotated posts, we can do some pretty interesting frame analyses, and that's what we're going to be talking about now. So we're first going to be discussing how both frames fares up against sentiment and toxicity classifiers. So as a reminder, harmful generalizations is one of our frames. And an example of a harmful generalization is something like, at mentioned, some people wear clothes at home I wear for an outing, and here I dress up like a homeless person inside my home who's a drug addict and has been sleeping since forever. And again, this post is reinforcing negative stereotypes of PEH being addicts or being lazy, etc. And we found that the Perspective API toxicity classifier was giving this pretty low, or was like this with a pretty low toxicity score of 0.35. And we wanted to look into this a little bit further. So we plotted the distribution of toxicity scores in posts labeled with harmful generalizations. And we found that a majority of the posts were labeled with a toxicity of less than 0.5. So it looks like Perspective API is actually missing out on some of these maybe more subtle or nuanced harmful generalizations against PEH. And this was also found in prior work, a paper called Aporophobia, which was looking at harmful language against people experiencing poverty. And they had a similar finding there where maybe harms against these compromised populations come up more subtly on social media data, and it looks like those are not really being captured by toxicity classifiers. We also compared this against a distribution of posts without harmful generalizations. And again, we find that a majority of these posts are labeled with a toxicity of less than 0.5, where we're expecting the harmful generalization posts to have more scores in the higher toxicity region.
What was the individual classification accuracy in harm gen?
The individual.
So you have a micro average of 0.54 or something like that. But for harm gen specifically, if it's around them, then this is not expected because about half of them probably are not actually on the generalization.
Right. So this was actually we calculated this on our set of expert annotated posts. So this is over 40K posts. Yeah, for that exact reason that those annotations are not perfect and maybe not all harmful generalizations are being captured. We did a similar analysis on sentiment using sentiment classifiers. We're here again, we're plotting a distribution of the negative sentiment scores in posts with harmful generalizations and without harmful generalizations. And here we're expecting that the posts with harmful generalizations have a lot more negative sentiment than posts without harmful generalizations. But upon running a significance test, we found that the negative sentiment distributions are significantly similar. Yes.
I thought that you could, another comparison you could do is to replace the word homeless with other like categories, so like disadvantaged people, and then do like the toxicity or the sentiment, and then you can get an idea for if it's more the word, like maybe they just don't recognize homeless people as like a disadvantaged class of people,
Right.
Or is it the actual way that homeless people are talked about, which like would if you use some other word there, but it's more the way, then that would tell you that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic suggestion. Yeah. So we also wanted to do a case study where we specifically looked at proposed solutions and interventions in posts that mention California. So as a reminder, solutions and interventions is another one of our frames. This post read, ever think that instead of jail, mentally ill homeless person needs actual help? Is I have compassion for his victims, but I also have compassion for this guy. He needs help. Why not use all these abandoned buildings in downtown LA as shelters for these people? What a waste of resources. Here, they're suggesting that we convert maybe just abandoned shelters or buildings as temporary shelters for PEH. And we wanted to measure the statistical prevalence of a term in California posts in two different subsets, in posts labeled with solutions and interventions, and in posts labeled with positive sentiment. So here, what we wanted to see is that solutions and interventions contains suggestions, positive solutions for PEH, and we wanted to see how sentiment classifiers are able to capture this kind of positive sentiment in discourse on homelessness. So here we ran we calculated a weighted log odds ratio in these two subsets. So in the left, we see the most relevant terms in posts labeled with solutions and interventions from our oath frames, and then in posts labeled with a positive sentiment score. And this table here shows the 5 most significant terms in each subset, along with their Z-scores. And we found that posts that are labeled with solutions and interventions actually capture more comprehensive insights that are specific to homelessness in California. For example, all these words, abandon, rent, and voucher, and Bass, are referring to Karen Bass's homelessness initiative Inside Safe, which converted abandoned hotels to temporary shelters for PEH in 2023. And then also rent and healthcare can be considered as drivers of homelessness in California, and also potential entry points for interventions. Whereas when we compare that to the most relevant terms that came up in the post labeled with positive sentiment, they provide more generic insights, things that we would expect, like great, love, new, thank, help. And here we're not saying that those are not necessarily useful, but in the context of homelessness or solutions and interventions frame, we can capture some of these more domain-specific insights that are particular to the issue. So connecting this back to the beginning of the presentation, we saw that real-world events can serve as catalysts for reactive and inflammatory comments on social media. And that's something that we wanted to look at with our analysis. So how do attitudes shift over time? And is this correlated to some of these real-world events that we see happening? As an example, we tracked attitudes between 2021 and 2023. And in December 2022, there was an event where Biden approved a $45 billion dollar bill for foreign aid for Ukrainians in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And this resulted in all sorts of comments on social media, particularly critiquing the government for how they might be allocating money, aid, and resources, again, amongst this time Ukrainians and citizens of the US, who are in this case, people experiencing homelessness. So there's these attitudes of government critique, money and aid allocation, and then who's more or less deserving or undeserving of resources. And this is a trend that we saw crop up many times in our analysis, where PEH were used as an example to maybe critique the government or talk about how the government's not doing a good job spending its funds and things like that. So we plotted the frequency of the attitudes between 2021 and 2023. And we observed this spike in December 2022. And when we qualitatively looked at these tweets, we saw that a lot of them were talking about the Russia-Ukraine crisis and how the government was not necessarily doing a good job of allocating money, aid, and resources between the country's issue versus providing aid for foreigners and things like that. And we were able to observe this spike in our trend and attitudes across these different months. And when you compare this to some of the other attitudes, we don't see as prominent of a spike. We ran a similar analysis in posts about New York. In January 30th, between January 30th and February 4th, 2023, the mayor was trying to convert hotels and motels to temporary shelters for immigrants. And this resulted in a very similar kind of backlash on Twitter about who should be more or less deserving of resources. And they were critiquing the government for not wanting hotels to be converted for immigrants, et cetera. And similarly, we can observe this spike in this government critique and deserving, undeserving attitudes between January 29th and February 4th. We were limited by the number of posts that we had about these different states, so limited by the amount of metadata that was available to us. But when comparing to all of the other attitudes or frequency of the other attitudes, we see that there is this prominent spike in government critique and deserving, undeserving attitudes. And the tweets themselves were the tweets themselves were talking about this exact event of converting motels to temporary shelters for immigrants. Yeah, so Twitter did not give us that metadata of where the tweet came from. So instead, we looked at posts that are talking about the state, so talking about New York or mentioned New York or some city. Yeah.
Is this this isn't normalized in any way?
So we could look at proportions as well of attitudes with respect to the other frames. We decided to plot frequency and instead just compare the frequency with respect to the other attitudes. But you're right, we could look at the proportions as well.
Do you analyze the same number of like total tweets per month? Or is the distribution of tweets also?
We tried to keep the distribution of tweets across the different months similar. But yeah, given the amount of limited data that we had, that also resulted in a smaller subset of the kind of analysis that we were able to do. Right. Yeah. So lastly, we also wanted to look at attitudes with respect to different states and socioeconomic factors. And this is with respect to different states because we didn't actually know the geographic origin of the tweet. So each state, and even go as far as saying each locality, has a different political and economic climate. And after talking with some of our community collaborators, they were not only interested in identifying the kinds of attitudes that showed up or the frequency of attitudes, but also potentially what are drivers of those attitudes in each state. And as an example, one of the things that they pointed out was that California has a much larger unsheltered homeless population than states like New York. And what that might result in is a larger visibility of PEH on the streets. And they hypothesized that because folks in California might be having more interactions with PEH on a day-to-day basis, that might result in more adverse reactions with them, more harmful generalizations. Yeah.
Can you clarify what you mean by like sheltered versus unsheltered homeless population?
Yeah. So unsheltered homeless population are folks that are not admitted formally into a shelter or temporary housing, whereas sheltered PEH are folks that are in the system. They're actively getting aid and resources from advocacy organizations.
Where would folks who are like couch surfing or kind of bouncing between friends' places fall in this?
It's a good question. There's a lot of like gray area between who's unsheltered versus who's sheltered, and I think that gray area is not necessarily like subsumed in any of these categories. It's more so in like shifting housing, folks who are like in the middle of this process. Yeah, so probably, and also folks who like collect this kind of data to collect these statistics. It's extremely difficult to account for people who are couch surfing or car surfing and things like that. So we ran a linear regression analysis where we we're looking at correlations between percent of unsheltered PEH with the proportion of posts labeled with, in this case scenario, harmful generalizations. And I want to point out here that we were again limited by the amount of data that was available to us. So in our data set, the states that were most prominently represented were these 12. And we found that a larger unsheltered PEH population loosely correlates to more harmful generalizations in that particular state. And I also want to point out, especially when we're doing these kinds of correlation analysis in domains of social science, it's difficult to make these kinds of strong conclusions from these kinds of analysis. We're simply looking for a correlation or a signal that perhaps maybe the percentage of unsheltered PEH could elicit more harmful generalizations driven by the hypothesis that our social work experts had.
And that the percentage of unsheltered PEH comes from government collection statistics, which also vary by state, by locality, right?
Exactly.
And the determination of a tweet being from a state depends also on keyword spotting.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
All those caveats. Yeah.
All those factors. Yeah.
Have you got some correlation of, so this is percentage of homeless people there, shelter or not. There are, of course, states where there are many more on shelter, right? So I volunteered for one homeless charity that reported that 70% of their people came from out of state.
Right.
Presumably from cooler states or low states. So that might kind of factor in, right? So that might be a factor, percentage of homeless people versus the whole population.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there's probably some relationship between that, but some of the negativity might stem from, just a larger percentage of.
That's true. People like coming from other states who are not necessarily from that state or native to that state as well. Yeah, that's a very good point. Like in California, or there was a news story that was circulating talking about how a lot of Republican-led cities were sending PEH to Democrat-led cities. And that kind of also resulted in this backlash from the public about like, we're getting a lot of influx of PEH. We don't have necessarily the services or infrastructure to account for that or to handle that. And yeah, that's a fantastic point. Definitely like a factor that we could consider and test as well. Cool. So we also looked at attitudes with respect to the cost of living index. And to give you an idea of how maybe this topic of cost of living shows up in our data set, this tweet reads, maybe if they would stop increasing the rent prices every year, we could get somewhere with the number of new homeless people on the street every day. California is starting to look apocalyptic. So they're talking about the ever increasing rent prices in California. We also saw a lot of tweets that were talking about like increasing the minimum wage in California and things like that, all of which contribute to the cost of living index. And oftentimes in California, at least, the rent prices or the increasing rent prices are also tied closely to the homelessness issue. People are saying that folks are experiencing homelessness every day more and more because they're not able to make rent and things like that. So again, in a similar way, we wanted to run a linear regression analysis, see how cost of living might correlate to government critique in this case. And we found that a higher cost of living index loosely correlates to a larger population of, a larger proportion of government critique attitudes. And this is, of course, accounting for all of the conflating factors that we discussed as well. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Is it possible any of like since it's keyword matching, like the DC ones have more to do with like DC as like government versus DC as the location?
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's more associated with politics and there's a lot of references to the White House as well in relation to DC. So again, indirectly referencing the president, the election and all that. Yeah. Yeah, also on the note of keyword matching, we used like an NER model. So we were trying to also capture just like cities within each state as well.
So for DC, did you use the general DC area and also include cities in Virginia and Maryland?
No, it was just, I think, looking for District of Columbia, yeah. But that would have been interesting as well, looking at the suburb areas. We're sorry.
The Arlington problem. Right.
I'm from the Northern Virginia area. So some key takeaways for I get into slightly different topic. So we were able to annotate more than 2 million social media posts on homelessness using a variety of different annotation strategies. We found that this expert validation of LLM generated annotations sped up our annotation by 6.5 times. And we were also able to do some of these interesting analyses, how it frames fares up against sentiment and toxicity classifiers. And there's a whole host of additional analyses that we have included in our paper with respect to different states, marginalized populations over time, and things like that. And ultimately, we want to develop this as a tool for advocacy organizations. The ones that I talked to, Community Solutions and National Alliance to End Homelessness throughout our project, are interested in our work and served as a sounding board for the kinds of analyses that we saw today. And beyond just identifying, again, the attitudes that are prevalent in our tweets, they're also advocacy organizations often have these very nuanced and specific questions that they're interested in. So my current project is on how can we build an aspect-based summarization tool for them that would provide them with more nuance going beyond the insights that our topology alone is able to surface.
So generally, the bottleneck of qualitative coding is like a huge issue, right? As you start. So it seems like a great thing to be able to provide a solution in this way. I'm wondering first, like generally, what is that community think about the viability of this kind of solution? Do they tend to be hostile, do they tend to be receptive? Oh my God, this is going to solve all our problems. Or they're like, why would you do this? You're really getting rid of the problem. You're just letting the models, like, what is generally the take?
Yeah, I think whenever working with any community collaborator, it's incredibly important to establish trust as first principle. So I have been talking with them for about a year now. We've been having weekly meetings, and we more so say that this is a tool that is supposed to serve as an assistant and not by any means meant to automate the work that they're doing. In fact, we need that kind of global feedback that they provide in the beginning to develop the topology, to understand the kinds of insights that they want out of our system. So they're very receptive to this kind of work that could serve as an assistant and scale up the analyses that they're doing. And in addition to that, I personally have had a very fantastic experience working with these community collaborators, learning how to incorporate domain expert feedback in a system that's using that's based on a large language model. I think is a very fascinating question, and lots of different ways to go about it.
Well, what about over exuberance? Do you see cases where people are like you sped things up by 6x, but it's clearly not a completely automated solution. So you can imagine people would just take the easy way out and come up with a completely automated solution and try to work on that. I don't know. Are you seeing that kind of effect as well?
I think there's a resistance or like a mistrust in the kinds of insights that these models are able to generate on their own. So in my experience, they've been wanting to be involved in the different stages of the process, but there's sometimes a communication gap into what is even possible using our language model. And even from the NLP side of it, there's a communication gap into what we should and should not automate, especially in working on these kinds of sensitive issues. So yeah, I have personally not experienced that. I don't know, maybe in the future, maybe.
Question regarding the annotation. So when the humans annotate, and even more so when the machines pre-annotate, you also look beyond the tweets. Right, so you can imagine that if I know that Jake, if I look at 100 tweets, and I can see there's a certain political leaning, you might be more conservative, or might be more progressive. One has a lot of conservative friends and progressive friends, and so that might be facilitating quite a bit to improve automating annotation. Not all posts are always fully coherent in
That's
what
true.
they say, and so
Yeah. So are you suggesting also looking at the annotator's socio-demographic background and how that might have an impact on how they're
even the sender of the tweets or whatever.
Yeah.
So if I know they're generally anti-homeless or pro-homeless.
Yeah, looking at the framing in terms of what are their values with respect to homelessness. Yeah, that's a fantastic point as well. Or what are their ethics surrounding the homelessness issue, or how do they think about it in terms of being sympathetic towards PEH, or in terms of, do they want to provide services? Do they want to, are they on the NIMBY end of the spectrum where they don't want homeless folks in their backyard and things like that? So yeah, that's a fantastic point as well. And something that was brought up by our social work collaborators as well, is beyond just the attitudes that are captured in topology. How is the issue itself framed in the tweet with respect to the ethics surrounding homelessness and providing services? Yeah.
And a question about using Twitter or X. So I think we're all aware that there's a lot of robot generated posts, and I'm wondering, it might influence the kind of conclusions that you make from this procedure, which seems really awesome way to speed up annotation. But I'm just wondering, do you think that there should be some pre-filtering step where we try to determine what's human and what's not? And do you have any ideas about how you might do this for this particular?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. We did have a pre-filtering step, not necessary to look at whether it was human or not, but might have served as a proxy to determine that. So our pre-filtering step included our public opinion filter, which identified whether or not something portrays an attitude towards homelessness, or something is just talking about something is talking about homelessness in a completely different context. But yeah, in the future, maybe that would be interesting to look at. There's also different platforms that we've been looking at into beyond Twitter. So Nextdoor is one platform that talks a lot about like community, what's going on in your community, in your neighborhood, and things like that. So perhaps shifting to different platforms or sources might also be interesting to look at.
Can you get into Nextdoor without using? I thought it was more of a gatekept kind of community.
Yeah, not public access, but some of our community collaborators have access to Nextdoor, so it would be interesting to run this kind of analysis on there. Cool. So yeah, this is a work in progress at the moment. We're looking to develop a dashboard. This also helps us interact with our community collaborators. It provides them with a better idea of what our system can provide, and also identify gaps and the kinds of things that they want to see out of this analysis. So I'm not sure how we're doing on time.
We're close to the end,
Close to the
but
end. Okay.
we can go over like a couple of minutes if you want to finish up.
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to end by talking a little bit about work that I'm doing currently in a slightly different domain, in the domain of suicide prevention and interventions. And this is again in collaboration with the School of Social Work. So some studies have shown that life disruptions such as relationship issues or financial problems are strongly associated with suicidal thoughts. One of these studies found that 27% of victims had evidence of an intimate partner problem, 1 in 10 had financial problems. And a lot of existing suicide interventions have been developed for the clinical sector, where less of an emphasis has been on interventions for non-clinical folks. By clinical sector, I mean psychologists, folks who are providing mental health services. And our social work collaborator, John Blosnich, wanted to explore the potential for new interventions for non-clinical professionals. These are people like lawyers, attorneys, folks who are providing, helping people through life disruptions like divorces or DUIs and things like that. And this is very much a new project, a work in progress. We want to explore this data set, NVDRS, which stands for the National Violent Death Reporting System. It includes death narratives that describe an individual's passing from suicide or their circumstances around their passing from suicide. And we want to see if we can reliably identify and characterize interactions between a victim with a non-clinical professional as an initial signal as to provide some support for the fact that it could be beneficial to have new interventions for non-clinical professionals. And we're hoping to see if we can use LLMs as assistants to social work to do this particular task, because the data is extremely graphic and content in this extremely graphic and contains very explicit content in this particular case. So that's a work in progress. And yeah, thank you. I'd love to take any more questions that you all have, and this is the link to our paper and demo.
Yeah, are there any questions in the audience? Zoom folks, you're welcome to unmute and ask or put them in the chat, whichever you prefer.
Is there potential to use the oath rings to sort of maybe demystify or correct any misperceptions about actual like homelessness? Like, I wonder if there's a discrepancy of what we actually know about like the causes, or you know, I'm pretty sure it's definitely a very complex issue, but like at least some minimal information that we know is pretty true about homelessness versus how people think about homelessness, and whether we can like use this to sort of bridge any gaps that we find there.
Yeah, this is a great idea, and something that the National Alliance to End Homelessness actually does. So they generate these reports on debunking myths to homelessness. So particularly what people think are the contributing factors to someone experiencing homelessness versus what are the real contributing factors. So as we saw in some of our tweets, people assume that PEH might be lazy, they might not want to find jobs, they I don't know, are drug addicts and things like that. And I think that would be a fantastic application of our work, identifying what are those trends and perceptions, and how these advocacy organizations can generate reports, news stories to identify that that might not actually be the case. Yeah, and there is, I pull this up because this was one of the initial iterations of oath frames that we were considering, these additive labels, so correlated factors, things like economics or mental health are all factors that are correlated with homelessness, and identifying these factors would also help with some of the things that you're talking about. How are people thinking about homelessness? How are people thinking about contributing factors to homelessness versus what's actually the case that these advocacy organizations are identifying?
Did you do any analysis that like studies what are the major groups that are considered undeserving versus deserving within that subset to see, I don't know, maybe advocacy groups can be like, oh, a lot of people think X group is undeserving, so maybe these people, any funds that go into the undeserving, we could sort of redirect to the deserving and have less public backlash or have more broader support for those kind of policies.
Yeah, we had this exact analysis in our paper where we were looking at who PEH were being compared to, and we found that they were some of the groups that we found them being compared to were Ukrainians, immigrants. Here are the two examples. And we had some analysis in our paper that talked about how they were being compared. So in the Ukrainian example, a lot of folks were talking about the government critique or money aid resource allocation, whereas when folks were comparing PEH to immigrants, they were expressing a lot more NIMBY attitudes or harmful generalizations. So that would also be extremely useful for an advocacy organization to understand perceptions towards other vulnerable populations included in this discourse.
Yeah, are there any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for your talk, Jaspreet. I want to mention that we will not have an MLP seminar next week on the 14th because of the MLP, and then the following week, the 21st, we will have Dog in from UCLA. So thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate your attendance.